Good morning again. Today our text is going to be in John 13, verses 1 to 17. And I'm going to spend the whole time there. To my mind, I don't think I have any other passages to read. So if you want to be anywhere, that's where you can be. John 13, 1 to 17. Verse 1, it says, "It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." As it was already pointed out to you today, Bobby Whippy, he talked last week about a very sensitive topic. He talked about where God is when loved ones die. And actually, oddly enough, today, that was John chapter 9. We're going to be in John 13 today. So there's a jump, but it's the same topic. It's about death. At least it starts to be about death, but I want to point out to you what Jesus wants for us and wants us to do in this life. But let's start where he starts. What do you think you'll do when your death is nearby? You know, I want to believe I will do a lot of crying. I want to believe there'll be a lot of crying around me too. I want to believe that I will hug my loved ones, that I'll have some great wisdom to give them. So, still waiting on the wisdom. But I want to be able to share with them, and I want them to share with me, to tell me how much I mean to them. That we're going to miss each other, that we won't forget each other, that we'll never forget the love we shared together. In our culture, we often would say that when somebody is dying, that their life flashes before their eyes, right? And they see the memory, the loved ones, those momentous occasions, those failures, those stresses, and maybe even memories that they thought they'd forgotten. They might have flash before their eyes again. We think often that that's what happens to everybody. We think that that's just the way it is. But, actually maybe not necessarily. I was doing some reading and I found out that in the ancient Mediterranean cultures, places like Greece and Italy, places like the Israelites where they lived, these cultures, they believed that when people were about to die, that they might receive some insight about themselves or their loved ones or this world. They believed that because they were suddenly so close to the veil between the living and the dead and the gods or the God, that they would then see things that others couldn't see. So in the Iliad, that famous story, as Hector lay dying, he actually predicted the death of his murderer Achilles. Likewise, Socrates, when he received the death sentence from Athens for corrupting the youth, he said he received it. It's an amazing story actually, where he didn't get furious, he didn't lash out, he just received it, argued his case, but then said, "Be that as it may." That's how it'll be. He said as well, "I am now in that condition in which men are most wont to prophesy, the time before death." And finally, moments before Jacob, Moses, and other biblical heroes die, if you go back and read their stories, they gather their loved ones around and they talk to them. They share with them. They often too would give predictions about the fate of Israel, the future, but they would gather people around. And what that means is when someone is about to die, you lean in close. And in John 13, Jesus realizes his time is coming. Verses 2 to 8. The evening meal was in progress for the Passover, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, and he took off his outer clothing, and he wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Then he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet also?" And Jesus replied, "You don't realize right now what I'm doing, but later you will." "No," said Peter, "you will never wash my feet." This is a deliberate scene. So why is Peter refusing Jesus? Why is he pushing Christ back and saying, "Never, I will never let you wash the feet, my dirty feet"? You probably know that in the first century, Jews did not have Reebok sneakers. Yeah, surprising. We found that out recently in archaeology. It was only invented like 100 years ago. What they had is sandals. And Judea, as you can imagine, was quite a dry, dusty place. Not only that, they didn't have a sewage system. So often you might walk through the streets, walk through mud, walk through food waste. You might walk through excrement, human or animal, feces. And so this meant that feet in Jerusalem were stinky, dirty, sweaty, covered perhaps in filth of all kinds, generally disgusting. So a common practice when you were entering a house, especially to eat, is to have your feet washed. Now, in fact, if you were visiting a house and the host did not offer that service to you, that was considered quite disrespectful to not offer that. But this was also a culture obsessed with purity. So who do you think did this, washing the feet? It wasn't just anybody, it was slaves, servants. And most often in a Jewish culture, it was probably the Gentile slaves who would do it, the non-Jews. This meant that Jesus was not only doing something unpleasant, he was taking the place of a slave in that group of people. The rabbi taking the place of a slave. And that's what Peter's reacting to in this story. He's looking at the self-deprecation of Jesus and he's saying, "Never, Lord, never. You should never ever wash anyone's feet. We should wash your feet, not you wash ours." He's saying that this isn't how things work. That's not the world. That's not how things work. You're God in the flesh. You're special. You don't wash our feet. And honestly, if you and I, if we were there today, back then we would be much the same. We live in a culture that's obsessed with power, with privilege, with honor, with glory, with victory. We live in a culture that's obsessed about rights and freedoms, about money and power and politics. We could never imagine, and I've used this analogy before, Christopher Luxon on the news. You know, what's Christopher Luxon? What's he doing? He's bowing down at the feet of the postman. And what's he doing? He's scrubbing the boots clean of the postie. That's just not heard of. That's not the culture we live in. That's not the world we live in. Taking a lower place than others in this culture is anathema. It's obscene, it's absurd, it's offensive, actually. And even we as Christians can be like that. As Christians, we can get sucked into this trap. For many of us, our relationship with God can actually almost be a way that we protect our self-esteem. We look at Jesus, we say, "He is the Lord of Lords. He's the Lord of creation. He's the great King, and I am one of his people. I'm one of his people. Not you, not them. I'm special. I'm different. And you're not. You're nothing. We're better than everyone else." One of my Bible college professors, he used to say at times like that, he would say, "Your God is too big. Your God is much too big. And you think you're big too." When we hear this story then, we can somehow think it's excuse me, we can think it's peripheral. It's a tangent to who God really is. We can think that one theologian actually said, well, looking at this story, fancy that. Despite the fact that he had come from God, he still washed their feet. That's kind of funny. But actually, the point we should take from this is washing their feet was exactly what he had to do precisely because he came from God. That's the sort of God we serve. He's revealing God to his disciples and to you and I. And that's who we find God to be. A God who pours himself out, a God who takes the form of a servant, a God who sacrifices himself, a God who does not hold himself above and crush and judge and be other. He's a God in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of the muck and the mud and the feces. That's our God. Right there in the trenches alongside us. Or I can explain it another way. Somebody delivered me water by the looks. Thank you for that. We can explain it another way. We actually have stories like this one in the ancient world. We have stories where it wasn't a slave that was washing feet, it was somebody else. And in those stories, we might find that there'd be a rabbi, and the devoted students would go grab the towel, go grab the basin, and bow to it because they want to show their devotion. You're my rabbi. I'm going to learn from you. I'm going to wash your feet. Another story we would have, and I'm actually going to take a piece from an ancient Jewish story, Joseph and Asenath. In other stories, though, we would find that a wife who loved her husband and wanted to show that devotion to him, she might wash his feet. She might take the place of that slave. So in the story of Joseph and Asenath, that scene happens. There's Joseph sitting there, they've just freshly been married. She walks in and she comes with a towel. And he knows what she's doing, and he says, no. He respects her, and he says, you should not do that. Go call one of your servants. Please, not you. But she says, and I quote, no, my lord, for your feet are my feet, and my hands are your hands. Another woman shall never wash your feet again. There's a beauty about these stories of devotion, of sacrifice, of honor. But you notice in all of these stories, the same thing is happening, that the one with the lower status is serving the one with the higher status, but not so in Jesus. For the first time in any of these stories, the rabbi serves the masters. The rabbi serves the master. The rabbi serves the students. He lowers himself below them and serves them in a humbling, degrading way, honestly, to show this is who God is. God is not afraid of serving others. In fact, humility and compassion are part and parcel of who he really is. This is just what he's like all the time. And he expects us as his disciples to be like that too. John 13, verse 13 to 17. Jesus says, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so. That's what I am. I'm your teacher. I'm the one who's given you I'm training you, I'm preparing you, I have authority over you. You call me Lord. I'm actually God. And you rightly should say those things. That's correct. But now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet also. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Wash one another's feet. Some churches have taken this to be quite literal, right? We've got churches all around the world that literally get out the bucket and the sponge once in a while. For some of them, it's during the Lord's Supper. They'll do that just like this scene. For some of them, it's a special festival, a special event, some great grand ceremony that's happening. Others consider it one of the sacraments, just like the Lord's Supper or the baptism, things that Christians are required to do where God's grace is manifested and transferred. But I'm not so sure, actually. I think it'd be amazing. We know people, you know people who've done this, and that would be amazing. But I'm not sure that's the whole sum of what we're supposed to take from this story. I don't think that's a bad thing. But I don't think he meant for us to just tack it on to the worship service. I think it's meant to characterize who we are, just like it characterizes who God is. My full-time job has me reading a lot of scripture. I don't pretend to know it all. There are people here who know more than I do. But I spend a lot of time reading the Bible. And one thing I'm coming to appreciate more as I grow older is just how little it talks about Sunday morning worship. You know, there's a few things here and there. But for most of Jesus' recorded life, he talks about things like loving your neighbor, about giving money to serve the poor. He talks about practicing forgiveness, about how valuable children are in the kingdom of God, that God should be at the center of your life. He very rarely has much to say about how many songs we should sing, what the prayer length should be, and what the starting time should be. Sunday morning, he doesn't talk about those things. He talks about other things that are important to him, and he's God in the flesh. And even Paul, who wrote 13 books in the New Testament, he spent about 12 chapters writing on worship in some kind. There are 260 chapters in the New Testament, give or take. 12 chapters or so are on worship service, on Sunday morning. But somehow we think the most important thing we do for God is from 10 to 12, or at 12, nearly 12, 11:25. Sunday morning, we think that's where God is focused. He's obsessed with this 2, 3, 4 hours on a Sunday. Where do we get this? We bicker instead about how good the sermon was, or who's allowed to speak, or what clothes we're wearing, or how long the service was. Instead, and I guess we neglect often, going out and actually practicing any of this stuff. We obsess and then we neglect. It's like we're over here slap fighting, and God's over there like looking around like, this is the mission field. Where is everybody? Where's my disciples? You remember what Jesus said to James and John? He said, the greatest among you won't be the elders, won't be the preacher, won't be the Bible school teachers. It will be your servant. The greatest among you will be your servant. And that brings us right to John 13. We need to put this into practice. So how can we do it? Put simply, whenever you lay yourself down in service of another person, you put John 13 into practice. You probably want me now to give you a definitive list of those times and those ways. You want me to give you how, and I can't. You have to figure that out. You're the one who stands before God. You're the disciple. You need to figure this out. But I will give you some examples. So I've got a list. I want to show you what this could look like in general life. And before I say that, I want to say that this church generally is quite good at this stuff. We're not necessarily a church that obsesses about Sunday morning as if it's the be-all and end-all. Generally, we are a serving church, and I want to commend that. But we could always keep doing that. We need to be reminded, and we could improve. So I want to talk about that. Here's examples. When you go home today, you will arrive at your house. And you can look to the left and the right, and you will see people in their houses. Those are called your neighbors. Amazing. Incredible. Huh? Such wisdom from... So your neighbors. Last year, the World Health Organization, this has been said before, but they declared it again, that there is a silent epidemic going around through the world, especially in places like New Zealand. No, I'm not talking about COVID 5.0. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about our isolation from each other. They described it last year as the damage that is being done to people is equivalent to sucking down 15 cigarettes a day. Just by that isolation, the mental health, the suicide rate, all of the, mental health is going down, suicide is flying up. People are being left behind. People are being cast aside. Your neighbors are some of those people who may right now be on a trajectory. And God has placed you in the mission field. He wants you to look at those people and think about, what can I do? How can I lay myself down for them? How can I sacrifice something that I find precious to give them something, maybe life, actually. Maybe to give them life. Life in abundance, life anew. To show them what God looks like in the flesh. You could just mow their lawn. Drop some baking off. It doesn't have to be fancy. Send them a letter. Drop them a letter in their letterbox. Don't even have to knock on the door. Whatever it takes, that mission field is right outside of your front door. And so few of us take it. And I'm like that. My home is my sanctuary. Don't ever talk to me when I'm at home, unless I invite you. So I've had to learn that. But this is a mission field. Or here's one related to Sunday morning. After worship next week. So I'm going to cast it to next week to say you don't just do it today and did it. Next week, go and look around. After the worship service, look around the room. Who is just on their own? Nobody's talking to them. Who is a visitor? I mean, this church is such a welcoming, loving, generous, spirited church. But in any church, including ours, this happens. Somebody walks in that door, and I'm talking to Trish and to Sue, and just too bad. Too bad for you. Hope somebody talks to you. It's not going to be me. We could do better. Back when I was in Perth, I remember on Sunday morning, I was an excited teen and 20s, and we'd finish church, and then I'd see you'd call him a lead pastor. He was like a preaching minister at the church there. He was a very friendly guy. He loved geeky stuff. I like geeky stuff. D&D, sci-fi novels. I would beeline to Eddie. I'd say, let's talk, Eddie. I've read the latest Star Wars. And he'd be like, that's great, John. Can I just... And then he'd leave, and he'd go talk to some random. And I was so angry. I was like, why is he doing this to me? Are we not friends? Why can't we hang out? I learned later, many years later, I figured it out. He can talk to me through the week anytime. You can talk to your loved ones, your friends, your family, anytime. I can talk to the Bible college staff anytime, the students. But there's somebody who might walk in that door one day, that's the only chance. One day. And I'm chatting to Amy about how great this shirt is. We could do better. I could lay myself down, lay that time down, give it to somebody else. And another thing. This is one I learned from Mike. When we go camping to any camping trip, the camp finishes, you're cleaning up. Where's Mike? What's he volunteering for? Cleaning the toilets. And I was like, thank you. I'm going to go stack these newspapers. Like, what am I doing? I learned from Mike that that's something nobody wants to do. Charles Spurgeon, he once said that there is no great rush for the lowest places. You will rob no one by seeking those out. That's what Mike was doing. Next time you're at a camp, it's cleanup time. Get in the toilet. Go clean the floors, scrub the kitchen, I don't know. Go clean somebody else's room that's not your own. These are ways that you can put into practice John 13. So simple. And yet these are ways you lay yourself down in service of others. And these are small ways. You could lift it up in the future. If you become boss over a bunch of people, and hard times have arrived, maybe you could take the pay cut and keep them at their level. Or if you're renting a house today, treat that property 2 times better than it deserves. You may think this place is a dump and I don't like my landlord. Treat that place as if it was your own. Treat that place as if Jesus himself was the landlord, even if it sucks to do that. These are ways that we can put into practice John 13. It's so simple. And yet Jesus showed us this simple act of sacrifice, washing feet, a grubby, thankless task for Gentile slaves. And he said, that's for me. That's the type of God I am. That's what I'm going to do. You'll find me in the toilet. You'll find me picking up people with cars broken down on the side of the road. You'll find me talking to the homeless, to slaves. You'll find me talking to people nobody cares about. That's the kind of God I am. And that's the kind of person you should be as a disciple of that God. That's what Jesus is telling us today. So whatever you do, whatever happens after you leave here today, just take that principle in mind that Jesus demonstrated. Lay yourself down to lift others up. To end today, I want to read an excerpt from a sermon by Fred Craddock. We talked about him at the college recently. Some of my students had to... Anyway, Fred Craddock, he's a very powerful preacher. And he was preaching a sermon on Genesis 31, where Jacob has just got his new wife Rachel, and they're going to go back home across the countryside all the way back to Canaan. And this is a big journey for her. She's not part of his people. She's a pagan. And so she promises him, she says, okay, Jacob, I'm your wife, I love you, and I trust you. I will follow your God, Yahweh. And he says, this is great, let's go. But secretly, she takes some of the pagan idols from her father's home and sneaks them into her bag, just in case. So that's the sermon. But I want to read something that it's the end of his sermon, actually. I want to read this excerpt. It touches on what we've been touching on. So, here it is. One day, the disciples could understand it no more. Jesus was talking about leaving, and he said to them, farewell. In a little while you won't see me. They couldn't stand it. So finally Philip, speaking for the group, said, show us God and we'll be satisfied. Just show us God. And Jesus said, oh, you want to see God. And a child, epileptic, falling in the fire, falling in the water, worrying his parents to death, is brought to Jesus. And Jesus hugs him and touches him and heals him. The disciples said, well, yes, that's nice, but we want to see God. And a leper comes, and Jesus reaches out and touches the leper and heals him. The disciples said, but we want to see God, we want to see God. And Jesus said, oh, you want to see God? Oh, I get it. So some young mothers come with their little babies, and the babies are crying, and the mothers have got the pacifiers in their mouths. They have to change a diaper, and it's a little bit disturbing, it's a little bit noisy, and the 12 apostles come in and say, get the kids out of here. We're trying to have the kingdom. But Jesus says, let the children come to me. Don't you stop them, for such is the kingdom of God. But we want to see God. Oh, you want to see God? Yes. So he took a towel and a basin of water and he washed their feet. They cried, oh, no, don't, no, we want to see God. He said, oh, you want to see God. And so he picked up a cross, started up the hill, turned around and looked at every one of us. And he said, have I been with you all of this time and you still don't know that whoever has seen me has seen God? That's what our God is like. That's who he is. That's what he does. He touches the sick. He has time for children. He loves the unlovable, and he washes filthy, stinky feet. What about you? Thank you, brothers and sisters. We will pray. Through the emails this week, I found a little meditation practice from another group that I'm going to just share around if you want to do some for your devotional time on this passage. But God bless you all.